What's up guys, Sagi here and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. Today I'm going to walk you through how I set up my A7 III for video. A lot of people buy a nice camera and then they use it with the default functions and settings. And I think that they aren't getting the most or maybe the best user experience that they can out of their gear. I think that one of the best things you get when you buy a higher end camera is the ability to customize it for exactly how you shoot. So I've been experimenting with different ways to customize my A7 III, and I now have all the buttons and settings just in an awesome way, and it makes it so that I only have to access the menu for two functions. I'm not sure why I can't assign those functions to a button or a menu, but we'll talk about that later on. All right, so let's get started. I'm gonna go page by page through the menu settings, then we'll do the buttons on the camera, and then finally we'll customize the function menu. To start off, go ahead and put the A7 III in movie mode on the top dial. Now, obviously we're shooting videos, so if you don't do this first, some of the features that I show you in the next section will be grayed out. Next, we want to go to the second camera settings, page 1, and set it to manual exposure. This means that we're going to manually control aperture, shutter speed, and ISO so that we have full creative control over our exposure. If you don't do this and you leave things on program auto, aperture priority, or shutter speed priority, you're going to start noticing that the A7 III will start altering your exposure as lighting conditions change, and that's going to ruin your video. Next, we're going to set resolution and frame rates. It's on the same page as the exposure mode. You're going to go to File Format and choose between 4K and HD. One of the reasons I got this camera is because of the incredible 4K quality. So I shoot in 4K even if I plan on downscaling it back to 1080p in post. And I have a video that talks about 4K and why you may or may not want to use it, so I'll link to that up in the corner and in the description. Next, we'll go to the next item down, which is record settings, and we're going to select between 24 and 30 frames per second. If you want the most cinematic look, go ahead and choose 24p 100 megabits per second, which will give you the best 4K footage that the A7 III can produce. And when I shoot for clients, I mostly use this setting. Now I shoot all of my channel videos at 30p 100 megabits per second because I happen to like that look right now. There is a 1.2 crop when using 30p instead of 24p, but it's not something that bothers me. Also, make sure that you have a fast SD card that can handle these higher bit rates. We also have the option to shoot at 1080p, which I use when I want to shoot the best slow motion this camera can do. To do this, select XAVC-S HD and then 120p, 100 megabits per second. And I'm going to talk about this more in the next section. So next I want to stay on the same page and go down to S&Q settings, which is a feature that I use to quickly get slow motion or quickly start a time lapse. So essentially S&Q lets you pick a frame rate between 1 and 120 frames per second, and then a playback speed of 24 or 30 frames per second. If you choose 120 frames per second and a playback speed of 30 frames per second, you'll get slow motion by a factor of 4. If you select 24 frames per second, you'll get slow motion by a factor of 5. On the other hand, if you picked 1 frame per second and a playback of 30 frames per second, you're speeding things up by a factor of 30, which sort of creates a time lapse. Now, I don't use these features very often, and here is why. For slow motion, it uses a lower bit rate than 1080p at 120 frames per second. The S&Q uses what ends up being 60 megabits per second, and in 1080p, I can shoot at 100 megabits per second. As far as time lapse, now that Sony released interval shooting, I'd rather do an actual time lapse at a much higher resolution and with full control, the ability to drag my shutter speed and all those things instead of letting the camera do it. If you want me to do a tutorial on that, just let me know in the comment section and I'll put one together. Okay, so why am I telling you to set this up if I don't use it a lot? Because there might be a situation where I'm shooting in 4K and then I need to very quickly switch to slow motion or I'll miss the action. And that's where I can just toggle this to S&Q and start shooting. I might not get the best slow motion I can get, but I'm not gonna miss the shot. Okay, next we're gonna set up the autofocus drive speed and tracking sensitivity. We're going to camera settings 2, page 2, and we're going to set the drive speed to fast. This dictates how fast the A7 III is going to rack focus once it decides that the footage is out of focus. So basically this controls how fast that transition happens. And I like it set to fast with the A7 III, which is not always true for every Sony camera. On some models, I don't like the fast because it's too abrupt, but with the A7 III, I like it set to fast. Next, we're going to set the autofocus tracking sensitivity to responsive, and this controls how much of a change the AF system needs to detect before it initiates pulling focus. Again, for me and how I shoot, I like to have this set to responsive rather than standard. Next, we're going to set the audio options, and we're still on camera settings 2, page 2, audio recording. Of course, you'll have to set this to on. Now, audio recording levels are going to depend on the microphone that you're using and how far away your subject is from the microphone. If you're using a non-powered microphone like the Rode Video Micro, then you're going to need to turn this up to a higher setting, something between 25 or 30 or even more, depending on how far away that person is from the microphone. If you're using a powered microphone like the Deity D3 Pro or the Rode Video Mic Pro Plus, you're going to want to use the microphone to amplify the sound instead of the A7 III's not so great preamps. These powered microphones have different plus dB settings, which allow you to have the microphone's high-end audio components do the work, and you'll get much better, cleaner, and more crisp audio. If you watched my must-have A7 III accessories video, I show you exactly what I do to get incredible audio, and I'll link to that video up in the corner and in the description. Finally, make sure that the audio level display is set to on so that you can see your levels while you're recording. Moving to the next page, we're on camera settings 2, page 3. We're going to the last option, which is movie with shutter, and we're going to make sure we turn this to on. This is going to allow us to start and stop recording with the shutter button rather than having to use this little tiny record button that's by the viewfinder. This is just a better overall user experience, and it's even more important if you plan on using a cage. Moving on to page 4 of camera settings 2, make sure that the steady shot is turned on so that you're enabling in-body image stabilization, and that the steady shot settings are set to auto, where the A7 III detects the focal length of the lens. The only time I would not use this is if steady shot was encountering some problems with the lens I was using, and I would need to set the focal length manually. Skipping page 5 and going to page 6 of camera settings 2, we're going to set the finder/monitor to monitor manual. By default, the A7 III is set to automatically activate the viewfinder and deactivate the LCD when you put the camera up to your face. And this makes sense when you're shooting photos and you're going to use the viewfinder a lot. However, for video, I very rarely use the viewfinder, and what ends up happening is that this switch is triggered when I'm trying to change settings in the camera. So I'll try to do something like press the menu button, but because my hand got close to the sensor, it'll turn the LCD off and switch to the viewfinder. And having this set to monitor manual means that it's never going to switch unless I manually tell it to do that. Now, I wish this feature was mode dependent so that I could still have it set to auto when I'm shooting photos and then monitor manual when I'm shooting video, but I haven't figured out how to do that. If anyone watching this knows whether this is possible or not, please let me know in the comment section. I would super appreciate it. Next, on the same page, we're going to select grid lines and then select whichever one of these options you like best. This will bring up the guide screens on the LCD and in the viewfinder and will help you with leveling and alignment. Some people like the squares, some people like the rule of thirds. It's really a personal preference, so pick whichever one works best for you. Now I want to change the dial setup feature so that the back dial changes aperture and the front dial changes shutter speed. Unless you're switching frame rates, you're not really going to use the shutter speed dial very often when you're shooting video because you're leaving it at twice your current frame rate. Your aperture, on the other hand, you're going to change all the time, so it makes more sense to have that on the back of the camera. Next, I set the power save start time to 5 minutes. I feel like anything under that is too short, and then 30 minutes is absurdly long. Next, we're going to go ahead and enable the touchscreen for focus. We're going to go to Setup 2 and then turn Touch Operations to on. Now I'm going to go and set the recording media settings. I'm going to want Auto Switch Media to be on so that if a card fills up, the camera automatically switches to the second card. Now we're done with settings, and we're really going to start customizing the buttons and dials on the body. So we're going to go to Camera Settings 2, page 8, and we're going to the second option, which is Custom Key for Video. You can see that the first option is for stills, the second is for video, and the third is for playback. So again, we're going to go to the one for video. The first thing we're going to do is set the control wheel to not set, telling the camera not to assign any function to the wheel. The control wheel is this thing right here on the back, and it's totally up to you if you want to use it for something. But I found that I unintentionally bumped it and I would either activate or change the setting all the time, which got old real quick. Moving on, we're going to set the C1 button and we're going to set it to white balance, which is on page 7 of the custom key options menu. This is such an important feature and one that I change all the time, and I want to have it available to me very quickly. This way I can just click on the C1 button and it will bring up the white balance options on the left, and I can quickly make adjustments. Next, I'm going to assign the APS-C Super 35 to full frame, which is on page 1 of the custom key options menu. This toggles between full frame mode and APS-C Super 35, which uses a cropped version of the sensor. And this works for me in two ways. First, if I'm using a lens that's designed for an APS-C sensor, like my Sigma 18-35 f1.8, I need to change this because it will not project an image that's big enough to cover the full frame sensor, and I'll see those edges of the lens come in. Next, if I'm using lenses that are designed for a full frame sensor, I can effectively change my field of view by cropping in. And this is great when I'm working with primes or if I want to get some more range out of my zoom lenses. Of course, I'm giving up some image quality, but the results are still outstanding. Next, we're going to set the C3 buttons to picture profile, which you'll find on page 7, and will let you quickly select a different picture profile without having to go into the menu. If you plan on doing some work in post, you want to maximize the amount of color information you're getting using the most dynamic range, I recommend that you select picture profile 7, which is set to S-Log2. On the other hand, if you still want to do better than the standard profiles, but don't want to use S-Log2, you can set one of the other profiles to Cine 4, HLG2, or HLG3, but that's for another video. Next, we have the C4 button, which I have set to autofocus area, which is on page 3. This lets me change from wide, which I use a lot, to zone, center, which I almost never use, flexible spot, to expand flexible spot, which again I also use quite a bit. If a scene quickly changes on me and I'm no longer in the best focus area option, I can easily change it on the fly. Next, we're going to set the multi-select center button to audio record levels, which are on page 9. This will quickly bring up the audio record levels we discussed during the setup and will let me make adjustments even while I'm recording. And this is super handy when the person I'm shooting starts speaking louder or more quietly than they did when I did my tests. I can just click on that button and very quickly make adjustments. Moving down on the back of the camera, we're going to set the center button to focus magnification, which is on page 8. This goes from 100% to 400% so you can really see what's in focus, and then click on it one more time to get back to the regular view. The next button we're going to customize is the left button, and I like to set this to monitor brightness, which is on page 14. This lets me quickly adjust the brightness of the monitor to accommodate for different shooting conditions, and also lets me save battery life. And I put this on the left button because it's the closest to the LCD, which makes it easier for me to remember. Okay, now let's go to the right button, which I set to ISO because it's the perfect spot for me. Now by default, this button is already set to ISO because it's following the settings for photo, but in case I ever change that and move the ISO button closer to the shutter, for example, I don't want my video setup to be impacted, so I make sure that I manually set it. I'm almost always shooting video in a manual ISO value and not an auto, so it's great to have this feature so close to my thumb when I need to quickly change it. Next, I set the down button to peaking display, which is on page 6, and this lets me turn on focus peaking when I'm using a manual focus. Depending on what we selected during setup, we'll see white, yellow, or red outlines on the items that are in focus. The next button I'm going to set up is the AEL, or Auto Exposure Lock, which lets you lock the current exposure settings when you're taking a picture so that when you reframe, the camera doesn't make any adjustments. We're going to set it to center lock on autofocus, which is on page 4. This feature activates subject tracking, and pressing the AEL button and then the center button will bring up a square at the center of the screen. We can point it at a subject and then press the center button again, and the camera will draw a white square around the item and begin tracking it as it moves through the frame. Because we activated the touchscreen, once we selected an item using the button, we can click on any other item on the screen, and that will move and make that the subject that's being tracked. Alright, for the next button, I'm going to give you two options. If you plan on shooting an S-Log2 or S-Log3, it can be difficult for you to visualize what the image would look like because it's so washed out on the screen. You can set the AF on to Gamma Display Assist, which is on page 17, and will automatically apply a Rec. 709 LUT to give you a more pleasing image to preview while you're shooting. If you don't want to use it for that, you might want to set it to Zebras, which will turn on the white lines and show you what areas of your video are overexposed. This way you can quickly turn this on or off, and you can get the highlight warning indicators which show you if anything is blown out. I don't have any lenses with a focus hold button, so I'm not going to set that to anything, but if you do, I'd love to have you tell me what you use it for in the comment section. Now let's move on to the functions menu. Most of the settings in this menu are pointless for video, so the first thing I did is wipe out the upper row functions, which cleaned up the menu really well. Next, I started adding functions, starting with focus mode. This allows me to quickly switch between autofocus continuous and manual focus. Some of my lenses don't have a toggle that puts them in manual focus, so this is a shortcut for me to activate that mode. The next thing I add is prioritize recording media, which lets me tell the camera which card to shoot to. A lot of times I'm shooting B-roll for two products at the same time, and it's nice to have all that footage split up on two separate cards. Now remember the S&Q feature we talked about? I also add the ability to quickly change the frame rate when I need it. As I mentioned, I only use this feature when I'm in a hurry, so every second counts, and it's much nicer not to have to go into the menu. Finally, I added the subject detection function, which is mostly because I use animal eye detection all the time when photographing our dogs, and sometimes I leave it on and then I wonder why face tracking is not working for video. And this lets me quickly adjust that when I realize that I forgot that it's on. Okay, so that is how I set up my A7 III for video, and it's something that I've been working on for months, and I finally have it exactly how I want it. I'd love to know how you set yours up, and I'm always happy to learn and get new ideas from you guys. If you haven't yet, make sure that you check out my must-have A7 III accessories video and my detailed review. I'm working on some more A7 III content for you guys. I'm going into detail about low light shooting, color grading, interval shooting, autofocus modes, and a lot more. So if you're interested in learning more, hit those subscribe and notification buttons. I'll put some links in the description to the body, as well as some of the lenses and accessories that I like, because there are always specials and discounts, and my links are automatically updated with the lowest price. I really hope I was able to give you some ideas about how you can set up your Sony A7 III for video. If I did, please let me know by leaving a comment, giving this video a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. And you know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.